Many, many years ago, I was on the web and I was reading about Michelangelo. And the thing that fascinated me in this particular passage was apparently, I don't know if the story is true or not, someone asked Michelangelo, how did you carve that beautiful angel in the marble? And his answer was, I saw the angel in the marble and I carved till I set it free. My brain exploded when I saw that because I said, that's the key. That's the key to success. So when many people start on a new task, a new challenge, a new project, they'll figure out what's my first step, what's my second step, what's my third step. But they don't have a clear vision of what the end state is going to be. So what I saw in that statement was just transformational for me. And I said, wow, what he was saying is he saw the angel in the marble and he figured, what's the last chop I'm going to take with my chisel and hammer? And instead of working forward where you don't know where you're going, he knew where he wanted to end up, and he worked backwards to get to the starting point. So now I'm going to give you all a little test to prove it. I hope I don't screw this up. I have a 9-quart container, and I have a 5-quart container. I have a faucet here, and I have a sink, and I know if I fill it and the meniscus is right here, I have exactly 5 quarts, and I know when I have 9 quarts. I want to end up with 6 quarts of water. Anyone have an idea? Let me, you got one, go ahead. Okay, let me ask a question. Would it help you if I said, visualize the outcome? Visualize 6 quarts of water here. Does that help? You see the end solution. Boom! You got 1 quart. Yeah, pour out the 9, pour in the 1 quart, pour in the 5. This is proof of Michelangelo's statement. And what happened to me, my brain exploded that day. I took a course, I was taking a graduate course in management at the UCLA Anderson School. And the professor's name is Moshe Rubinstein. He wrote a lot of books with his daughter about patterns in problem solving. And I remembered what he said. He said, you got to visualize the solution and then work backwards. So I put the 2 and 2 together. So now let me give you some real-time issues. Some will be management and some will be technical. At the end of the Cold War, I ran an organization called TRW Space and Technology Group. It was started by an absolute genius, my mentor, a fellow named Simon Ramo. He graduated from Caltech with a PhD, then went to work at GE, and then if you go back in the history books, there was a crazy guy named Howard Hughes who formed some incredible companies. And Cy started Hughes Electronics. And Howard Hughes was a little crazy. There's some movies about him. He had problems. But in any case, the Cold War was really heating up. And in 1955, Russia exploded a 55 megaton hydrogen bomb in the atmosphere. It was horrifying living in those times. And President Eisenhower called Cy Ramo a few days later, his son told me, and asked him to develop a bullet missile for America. And he worked with someone named Bernard Shraver. And Cy, too, saw the image, saw the vision in the marble and worked backwards. And literally 8 years never having a solid rocket. 8 years from the day that call came until the time there were a few hundred ballistic missiles in the heartland of America called the Minuteman. So the principle really works. Okay, so with that as a background, the Cold War's over. I had roughly 10,000 people in my organization, and this is circa 1991. America wanted a Cold War dividend. And in the defense business, it goes up and down. And sometimes we overreact in America. They didn't see the angel in the marble. I had to lay off 5,000 people in 3 months. It was painful. But then I was doing a variety. I was going to get commercial work. I got a call from the president's office. And the call asked me if I wanted to be the next NASA administrator. And NASA at the time had a budget like this. These are in billions of dollars. I'll get away from the board in a minute. This was now circa February of 92. And this is and the NASA budget was here's 92. So it was $14.3 billion. And over 10 years, it was going to rise to that. And so the area under the curve is a lot of money. And unfortunately, NASA started Space Station Freedom in 1984, and by 1992, 8 years later, they were supposed to have this giant space station up on orbit to compete with the Mir space station. The day I went for my interview with the president, I was told not only didn't they have anything on orbit, they didn't have one piece of hardware. And they spent the full $8 billion. And they were demanding more. And then I was told the shuttle's been grounded this is after the Challenger, but before the Columbia. The shuttle's challenged with hydrogen leaks, and it was grounded. The Galileo spacecraft on its way to Jupiter, the antenna didn't deploy, $3.5 billion. The Hubble Space Telescope had a little problem with being a spherical aberration, and it was myopic, $5 billion. And the weather satellites at geostationary orbit were dead. And when I went so I'm crazy. I had a vision, and I told the president yes. And then I went to the Congress, and they said, NASA's budget is scheduled to go from here to here, but they're so bad forget about this money. And if you want to get confirmed, you got to sign up the $14.3 billion for 10 years. Maybe you'll get fired, but whoever comes in will have that job. And on top of that, there's a 3% inflation. $33%. Do you still want this job? You could go read the testimony at my confirmation. I took it. And what I did was I laid out the end state over here. And I worked backwards. And the first thing I did is I said, there are two types of projects. One are frogs. We'll get to reality in a minute. And the other are caterpillars. And I had to immediately find $50 billion, or else there'd be no NASA. On top of that, members of the Congress and the NASA family and the American public said safety and how much you spend are one and the same. I wrote that down on a piece of paper. Absolutely false. Safety doesn't come from spending money. Safety comes from thinking. And I'll give you a couple examples. So let's take the first step that I undertook. Saw the angel in the marble, and it said I had to eliminate $50 billion, and then I had to find a way of taking some more out. So that said, NASA was at a workforce of 25,000. It had to go to 17,000. Now it's civil servants. Go try and fire civil servants. Now, I don't want to come across as crass or not sensitive, but this is taxpayer money. There are roughly 300 million taxpayers that pay $11,000 a year in good faith that the American government is going to work for them. So let's start with the easier part, the frogs and the caterpillars. In the 50s, there was a congressman from Wisconsin whose name I can't remember. Proxmire? And he equated communism to frogs swimming in a pot. And he said if you put a frog in a pot, it'll swim and you turn the heat up. It will then swim until it dies. If you put a pot of boiling water and throw the frog in, it'll jump out. And it made sense to me because I took a look at the projects that NASA had, and I'm going to give you a very specific example. There were frogs. These projects were in perpetual motion because the research was interesting, but they were not living with their budgets, and they weren't achieving the objective. Case in point. President Reagan in 1984 started a program called the National Aerospace Plane. The rejuvenation of hypersonics after the X-15, which with a pilot got the Mach 6.7. Amazing. In 1967, this happened while I was still a research engineer at NASA. And they were going to build a plane for public use, commercial, and also for military use. It was going to travel Mach 5. And it was called the Orient Express. It would go from San Francisco to Tokyo in 2 to 3 hours. Fabulous. So I got there, And I saw there was $1.6 billion spent and another $5 billion to go. So I got 10% already. I found my first frog. So what did I do? You can't go in and arbitrarily cancel something. So I asked two questions. Question number one. And by the way, you can go and check this up yourselves. The idea was they didn't have a scramjet, and I was just through the propulsion labs. But what they were doing is they were going to scoop up the oxygen in the atmosphere by traveling real fast and scooping it up, putting it in the tanks. But when you go fast through the atmosphere where it's dense and there's oxygen, the leading edges are going to get damn hot, right? So I asked the question, what temperature is the leading edge going to be? And what material do you have that has a few 100-degree margin on that temperature? I didn't get an answer after $1.6 billion. You just can't make this up. Question number two. Where does flow separation occur? You know what flow separation, everybody? That's when you go from laminar to turbulent. Is flow separation occurring at the leading edge, or is it at the trailing edge? Now, if it's a leading edge, you fall out of the sky, right? The trailing edge, you're going to fly. Computational fluid dynamics was not at the stage where you could make such a calculation. Nobody was bad. But the point is, you got to kill the frogs. And I'm sure each one of you, in your pursuits, have come to parts in the path where you have to know whether you go this way or that way. And sometimes you have to kill the frog, no matter how much you love that frog, because you're wasting resources. Now, let's talk about the caterpillars. A caterpillar is a pretty ugly beast. It's hairy and squiggly. And people generally ignore caterpillars. And, but they become beautiful butterflies. So the next thing that I did is I worked with the people at NASA, who were all terrific. Nobody was bad. And I don't want anyone to get the impression that I'm talking badly about anyone at NASA. It's just about the process, about seeing where you want to be, and life is about making decisions. You can't keep everything going. In your research, you'll come to a parting of paths. You go this way or you go that way, and you got to know whether you're looking at a caterpillar, which will become a beautiful butterfly, or you got yourself a frog that you got to kill. It's a little graphic, so maybe I'm not too woke, so forgive me. So I found a whole bunch of caterpillars. NASA at the time was building spacecraft. On average, it was taking 9.6 years across everything they did from the day they got authority to proceed until it was on orbit. And on average, they cost $600 million. And I went around and I literally did town hall meetings and I asked people, what do you got? And what I got was the Mars Pathfinder mission. They were just finishing up something called the Mars Explorer, which was going to go into orbit about Mars. It was going to be launched in 1992. Cost $1 billion. It took 10 years. And by the time I was in my study, in 93, when I was making these decisions, it didn't get to Mars. It didn't get to Mars because they had a frog in it. Some genius on $1 billion program decided to use an attitude control system from geostationary orbit to go into orbit about Mars. Unbelievable. There was a group at the Jet Propulsion Lab that talked to me about their idea. They said, why do we want to use retro rockets? They're very expensive. If I have retro rockets, I'm going to land on a precise place. And the control systems for retro rockets are really complicated. They said, we have airbags. They went to the company in Delaware that makes airbags, and they said, could you make giant airbags for us? And the concept was, if you took an airbag and when you got above the right point on the surface and just blew it up, it would bounce and bounce and bounce. I have a video. You can go to the web, you could find it. Look up the Mars Pathfinder, you'll see it. So then I said to them, you know what? We really want to do precision things on Mars, and people have been using retro rockets because you could land exactly where you want. So I said, why don't we put a robot on? So now, if I bounce, 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 and I'm off by 3, 4, 5 miles, I could get the robot to go to where I want. So we added a robot to the Mars Pathfinder, $300 million, and in 3 years we launched it to Mars. That was a caterpillar that people didn't recognize at NASA, and that was one of the first decisions that we made. So that's the first part of it. Now, let's deal with this. And there was a caterpillar for that. What do you do? How do you tell 8,000 people we can't afford you? And I thought about it, and I said, wow. In companies, and I took a look at the age distribution at NASA. Again, I saw the angel and marble, and I worked backwards, and I said, let me see how the age of the people. And the NASA workforce was really aging. And I knew that there'd be people who, if they had a buyout package, which the government never afforded, they might take it up, and they might be happy. And I asked the White House, and I went to the Office of Management and Budget. No, you can't do that. The president approved that I could go to the Congress. We got a buyout package, and 8,000 people took the buyout, and there wasn't one forced layoff. That was a caterpillar. That's an example. Okay, what can we talk about now? You got the concept? Good. Because someone in this room is going to be a major leader. I found this really helpful. But the bottom line, you could go to the web, and except for a few years, the budget that I had over that time, it dropped, I think, 3 times by $150 million. The shuttle was launched 60 times. When I got to NASA, the human spaceflight program, shuttle and space station, was 60% of the budget. Science was 13% of the budget, and technology was another. It was 1/3 science, 1/3 human spaceflight, and 1/3 infrastructure and technology. So there were a lot of caterpillars that were there, but people didn't do it. Now, one of the advantages that I had is I came to NASA, and I had already personally designed many spacecraft myself, and that was a distinct advantage. But on the other hand, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure out the things I just told you about. You just have to think through and know where you want to go. And basically, I was able, I shouldn't say I, the team who worked with me was able to find $50 billion of programs that were frogs. We canceled them. And in that time period, we flew 394 people to Earth orbit, not on these loop-de-loop flights. It's more than any country, more than any human being, and not one of them got a scratch. So let's talk about safety. Safety And you folks have all sorts of dangerous things around here. Some of the propellants, the temperatures, the pressures. Safety is a state of mind. Safety is not how much money am I going to spend. Safety is not over-designing things to stupid. And the probability that the shuttle, the day I walked into the NASA administrator's office, was 1 in 92. It wouldn't make it. 1 in 72. Not good odds. The way you overcome that is with the human interaction and a sense about humans to safety. And we were able to launch the shuttle 60 times, and we didn't have a problem. Okay, let me see. What else could I talk about? Aha, I got another one. We had to put a contact lens on the Hubble Space Telescope. Again, this is it. Some of you weren't even born when we did the Shuttle Hubble Rescue Mission. That was 93. I had a lot of stressful things. I didn't sleep for 11 days. But when you're in the boss box, once you start the mission, you zip your lips and you sit and you stay put, and you have to trust your people. And there was another exercise that we did on that mission. And let me see if I could, visualize the future and work backwards. I actually use this. The team came to me, and it was a pre-flight briefing. I think it was 3-4 months in advance. And they said, we have 11 tasks to do so that the Hubble will have clear vision and will fix a lot of the things that were wrong with it. The solar rays were in trouble, and they had some reaction wheels that failed. And they said, it's going to take us, there are 11 tasks, and it's going to take exactly 11 days. And when the shuttle was flying, that's all you had. That was the amount of fuel and oxygen and everything on the shuttle. And they said, boss, we're ready to go. I said, get out of my office. I said, visualize the solution. I told him the story about Michelangelo. I said, visualize the solution and work backwards. And don't you dare come to me with anything that isn't absolutely essential for mission success. So rather than showing how thorough you are, engage your brains and say, as I work backwards, what's the most important thing I got to do? Then what's the next most important thing? And they came back and said, oh my goodness, there's only 7 things we have to do. We now had 4 days margin. And they ended up doing 11 things. But if something went wrong and you didn't have a contingency, the mission would have failed. So this principle really works. December of 93, we fixed the Hubble telescope. It was so stressful. I was wanting to say something and pick up the phone, and I had to keep stopping myself. But they pulled it off. 2 years later, a group of people came to see me, and they said, we have a great idea for a new telescope. We want to build a giant telescope bigger than the Hubble, and the Hubble just has its focal plane cooled. We want to cool the whole telescope. Now, does everyone understand what Doppler shift is? Raise your hands. If you don't, I'll get you thrown out of school. Now, the universe is expanding at an incredible rate. And the object of what they wanted to do was they wanted to see the first stars and galaxies that ignited after the Big Bang. And the Big Bang was 13.8 billion years ago, give take a few years. And it's 150 million to 300 million after that. It's, the universe cooled down, and then, finally you got electrons and other such things. So because of the expansion rate, if I don't cool the telescope such that it's much cooler than the wavelength, the Doppler shifted wavelength, the light is coming to the Earth in long wave IR, very long wave. If it's too hot, it's not you'll have self-interference by the telescope. Now, the Hubble went back pretty far, but nowhere's near there because they use a little trick. It's called gravitational lensing. That if there's a giant galaxy in between you and what you're looking at to the beginning of creation, it'll bend the light. According to Einstein, that's how Einstein's theory of relativity got proved. So the Hubble could see back, but they wanted to see all the way. And it was a very noble cause. So they said, we'd like to build a telescope with that as a background, a telescope that's 4 meters in diameter, and it's cooled to 60 degrees Kelvin. Now, as I make the telescope bigger, you get a much better reception on signal to noise. Goes as this ratio squared. And I said, why do you want to build it 4 meters? That's dumber than anything I've ever seen. I'm pretty candid. I wasn't being, I was not trying to mock them, but I grew up in the South Bronx. So, and they said, you can't build anything bigger than 4 meters. I said, why? They said, it's got to be monolithic, and we can't make anything bigger than 4 meters. But if I'm making a monolithic mirror, it's pretty thick to get it stiff, so you could get good reflections. And I said, why did you limit it to 4 meters? They said, that's what the shuttle could take. Huh? The shuttle goes into low Earth orbit. Why was I concerned about them putting it on the shuttle? Anyone have an idea? What if I gave you a hint? Albedo radiation. What happens? The sun shines on the Earth reflects the energy. It's got a reflectance of 90%. So now I'm going to put this telescope there, and they were going to cool it to 60 degrees, but it needed to be cooled to 30 degrees. But you could never cool it to 60 degrees because the albedo is just going to heat it up. And what am I going to do? Put a refrigerator? There isn't enough electricity you could generate from solar cells. So I said, have you ever seen a flower? And when the flower has petals, it opens up. Couldn't we do that with a mirror? Impossible. You can't make this up. Impossible. You can't get down to that temperature. Impossible. So what happened was, I got angry, and I got together with the CTO of NASA, a wonderful human being, Sam Vanieri. He passed away. Just an amazing guy. We talked. We decided that you could build an 8-meter deployable, adaptive. What do I mean? If I have a monolithic mirror, it's so stiff with all the thermal loads, you could guarantee the surface. That's what the Hubble is, 2.4 meters. So big whoop, they were going to go from 2.4 meters to 4 meters. But if I want to get really good signal to noise, hopefully I could go to 8, but I could tolerate 6.5. And then, what if I built it out of petals, like a flower, or maybe like a checkerboard, and maybe the hexagonal. And maybe I had a way of stacking them. So you just got to do conceptual. You can't be afraid and stick with the past. It's scary when you do something and you say you're going to do it and you could fail. So if you want to be a great engineer, don't be afraid of failure, because you're going to have them, and it's devastating. There was one time, I've had my failures, believe me. But the reason that this is such a great country is people aren't afraid to take risk. And unfortunately, my generation gave birth to children that are your parents, and as each generation came along, we became much more risk-averse in doing tough things. The stress was pretty damn high when I said this. And Sam and I, we even wrote a paper on how we'd use virtual reality to design it. Go to the mechanical engineering, you'll see it. We did it, I think, in 96. But we became convinced that you could build a deployable adaptive optic, maybe 8 meters, maybe 6.5. And we funded the team at NASA Goddard. There's a fellow there named John Mather. Read about him. He's the only NASA employee ever to win a Nobel Prize. And he won the Nobel Prize for figuring out the cosmic background radiation that existed. The reverberations of the Big Bang are still in the cosmic background radiation. He was the chief scientist for what became the web. So I gave this big speech in not Austin, Texas, San Antonio, to the American Astrophysical Society. There were 1,400 astrophysicists there. And up comes a nose-picking rocket scientist from the Bronx. And I told them how we're going to have to build the future of astrophysics. And I laid out all the telescopes, the Chandrasekhar X-ray telescope, the Spitzer 4-degree Kelvin focal plane, the whole telescope, and all of that. I got a standing ovation. I went back and gave John Mather the money. So he laid out a program for the Webb Space Telescope. And I left NASA in 2001, satisfied because I love astrophysics. You can't have favorite children, but that was my favorite child. And it really, really worked out well. Northrop Grumman, the team that I trained, Northrop Grumman bought TRW, Thomson Ramo Wooldridge. And the team that I worked with, building all sorts of incredible things, was going to build it. I was at peace. And what their plan was, they were going to use the Delta IV Heavy. You could go to the web and read about this. I don't have time to tell you. The Delta IV Heavy had unbelievable throw rate. And instead of going into low Earth orbit where you have the albedo radiation, the radiation reflecting off the Earth, I think John Mather or one of his people said, no, let's go to the solar libration point L2. That's in the penumbra of the Earth, and it's the stable point. And as the Earth is going around the sun, this is about 1 million miles behind the Earth, and it's in an equilibration mode. There's very little perturbation. So now I have something where I know where the sun always is. If I'm in Earth orbit, the solar rays go around and the communications go. So it was a very simple spacecraft. And then I could rotate the spacecraft around and see anywhere in the heavens. But I don't want to look at the sun, of course. And then what you do is, because you know where the sun is, you could put a giant heat shield, 3 layers of mylar or whatever it is, and without any active cooling. It was brilliant design, but they needed to take 10,000 pounds there. So they needed the Delta II Heavy, which was built by the Boeing company. Great rocket, absolutely fabulous rocket. That was in 73, so they designed the system. So 4 years into the design, someone decides they're going to go to the Ariane 5 because we're going to have a love affair with the French and Italians and Europe. I love them. I'm not being anti-Europe. I'm not being anti-Europe. But when you're building something, you don't let go and change it in the middle. And the Ariane 5 could only take 6,500 kilograms, not 10,000 kilograms. 4 years into the design process, the engineers and scientists at Goddard and at Northrop Grumman and Ball Aerospace, they had to change the design. And then there was an anger. Why is NASA so screwed up? Why are they overrunning? Why is it costing $10 billion instead of $5 billion? Why is it taking 2 decades instead of 1? You guys know what a biplane is? There's an old expression about biplanes years ago. Actually, if you go to Oshkosh, you could still see it. I'll come back to Oshkosh in a minute. So they had people that used to do wing walking. This is during the terrible depression of the 30s, and people were so desperate to get money, they'd have planes flying by people who would pay money, and they'd wing walk. And the rule of wing walking is you never let go of this strut before your hand's on that one. And what NASA did is they let go of a strut. To tremendous embarrassment, and the American and world public does not understand the brilliance of what those engineers did. I'm a little aggrieved on this, because these are terrific people that will put up with, forgive the expression, a lot of crap about their incompetence. You could listen to the Senate hearings. I tell you this not out of arrogance, but to say, when you're in charge in the future, understand what you're doing and don't accept anyone changing it for arbitrary reasons. It happens time after time after time. So what does it say? You got to believe in yourself. I'm fortunate I had a father that was wonderful. It was not fun growing up with him, but I believe in myself. And I hope if you get one message from me today is understand what your vision is. Do the homework to make sure you know what you're doing so you're in charge of your situation, and never compromise, even if you have to throw your badge on the table or quit. Never allow. Thank you very much.